Hi, and welcome to Epic Content Marketing 2016. I'm here with Ann Handley, and you just had a talk I missed, unfortunately. So I'm just as curious as our audience here. Can you give us a brief introduction on what you were talking about?
Sure. So I'm here in Norway talking about my first time in Norway, by the way, which is awesome. So I'm here in Norway talking about my favorite subject, which is content marketing, and especially how to create content that is a step above all the other stuff that's out there.
Yeah.
My philosophy is that we don't need more content in our world, we need better content, but this notion of better content is difficult, right?
Yeah.
It's just it's hard to pin down. So what I try to do is kind of lay out a prescription, in a sense, for how do we actually create the kind of content that's going to engage the audiences we want to engage.
But how do you know what's better?
So, and that's going to vary depending on your company, on your audience, who you're talking to, how you are, who you are. So in my mind, the best content has three elements that's across the board. First is it's bigger. It puts your product or service in a bigger context. It's bolder. It has bolder marketing, and I think it's created by bolder marketers who have to take a little bit of risk to create the kind of content that's truly going to engage. And then it's also braver. It has a braver tone of voice. It has a braver perspective. What I shared today is, if you masked the logo, if you covered up the elements, the design elements that would indicate that a piece of content is yours, if you covered up the branding and your logo and everything else, do you recognize you? Or do you sound like everybody else?
Yeah. And so, let's say a good piece of content is often, even here, described as something that's kind of branched out of the brand and kind of built its own brand. But what you're suggesting is pulling it back and, feel free to add your logo and do stuff that relates to your brand. But won't that kind of, take the content marketing perspective out of it?
No, what I'm saying is the way that you sound, for example, your perspective, your tone of voice, if that should be relevant to your brand, that should marry your brand well. People should be able to recognize that this is from you in the sense that, you have a point of view that others don't have.
Yeah.
So it's not about, talking only about yourself, or it's not about talking about yourself at all. It's not about having, a story that's about your brand. It's actually communicating in a way that is relevant to your customers, but that at the same time extends or amplifies your own point of view. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. One thing that's really trending in our business now is the discussion of whether sponsored content should be labeled or not. And the reason why is that I think most brands in Norway are afraid of putting their brand and their business in the context of the content that's being published. So would you rather have businesses kind of take pride in their product that's being advertised or marketed, or should we still just kind of keep things as it would be a normal article on a news site or a blog? And how would you kind of push the brand in there without making it look like advertising?
Well, in my mind, the best content isn't advertising. I mean, advertising is very different than content marketing in my mind. I shared an example today of when you take advertising and just shove it into a content marketing construct and call it content. That doesn't make it content. That's still advertising. Yeah. And so the real difference between advertising and content is that advertising is about the brand. It's about the company. It's about us saying, here's why we're amazing. Here's why we're better. Yeah. Where in my mind, content is about the customer. Yeah. So it's about, here's how our brand can help you. That's a subtle difference, but it's a huge one. Yeah. And so in my mind, that's where the real value of content marketing comes into play. That's where the context piece, the bigger story. And so I don't think it's about, labeled versus non-labeled. I mean, there's no...
Because the objectives will still remain the same.
Right. The objectives are always to drive business. But I think in one situation, you're just talking about yourself. In another, you're putting your brand in or your company or your service or your product, in the context of why your customers or your prospects or your audience should care.
When I'm doing these interviews, I often end with asking the interviewee to give small businesses who want to start a tip on where to get started. But I want to do a twist with you and see if you have any tips or suggestions for bigger, more established businesses that have money to spend, that kind of have done content in forms of blogs and in forms of sponsored stuff and stuff like that. Do you have any tips for them to leverage the power of content?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I would say that the approach is the same, whether you are a small business or whether you're a big company, a big brand. In my mind, the best content is more about brains than it is about budget.
Yeah.
And I think especially for bigger companies who just do have a lot of money to burn, a lot of money to put out there, sometimes they don't always have the best content because, in a sense, they're putting too much money towards something, and not thinking through, the bigger, bolder, braver idea.
Yeah.
And so I think the best place to start is always with your customer. Figure out, or your prospect, or your audience. Figure out how can we help that person. What information can we deliver to them at a depth and a breadth that doesn't otherwise exist?
Yeah.
And I'll give you a big brand example. GE, General Electric. They publish a site, that's independent of General Electric website called GE Reports. It's probably the best branded content out there. It's from a big brand. They do have some big muscle behind it, some big budget behind it. But at the same time, the reason I love it isn't because they have the biggest budget. It's because it's very relevant to the needs of the people that they're trying to reach, which are scientists, which are people who care about developments in science. They're also looking to reach analysts and people who are looking at GE as a company.
And it's actually one of the few examples I've heard about these 2 days where
really?
the brand is included in the content.
Yes.
GE Reports.
Yeah, it is from GE. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, it's a fantastic site because it's an interesting read. I go there all the time just to sort of see what's up with the world of science.
Yeah.
So it's a great example of of a bigger brand producing content. But ultimately, they could do that at a much at a scaled back pace because they've thought about the audience first.
So if you would leave our audience and the audience at this conference with 1 or 2 sentences of what they should do, like when they get back to their offices tomorrow or today, where should they start?
I think the biggest thing is to figure out, as I mentioned, what value you can deliver to your audience. Your content should always come from that place. I always think of it as a point of generosity. You shouldn't be thinking about, what can I do for us, for me. It should be what can we do for your audience. Yeah. Because ironically, ultimately your content will be more successful if you really think about how you can help your audience first.
Yeah. Good points.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.